Welcome. Bienvenue to Cassoulet Confessions. Food, France, Family, and the Stew That Saved My Soul. Written by Sylvie Bigar. My name is Renee Ketchum, and I am the chair of the Cultural Offerings Committee of AFUSA. And grand merci to our sponsors, France Today and Bonjour Paris. AFUSA is the largest Alliance Française network in the world, helping 25,000 learners of French each year learn French, live French, and love French. Please take a look at the afusa.org website. We have some wonderful events coming up. One Film, One Federation discussing Le Cercle Rouge with the Melville Foundation. Beth Gersh-Nessick talking about the brilliant exhibit that many of us saw in Paris, Sarah Bernhardt au Petit Palais, with Carol Ockman as part of the conversation. Adrian Leeds returns, and then we have yet another final December One Film, One Federation discussing Bob et le Flambeur avec, again, the Melville Foundation. During the presentation, please stay on mute, stay on speaker view. Please put your questions in the chat that we will cover after the presentation. And if you have any technical issues, please sign back in after a couple of minutes using the original Zoom link. This event is being recorded for our YouTube channel, and the total runtime should be about 1 hour. I'm really honored to introduce Sylvie Bigar, award-winning food and travel writer. Sylvie's writing has appeared widely, including the New York Times, Washington Post, Food and Wine, Forbes, Saveur, Bon Appetit, Edible Departures, Travel and Leisure, and National Geographic Traveler. Morgan Bauman is the owner of the Clay Coyote Pottery Studio. Her rural Minnesota pottery studio is known for making the only handmade clay casseroles in America, and I've already bought 2 of them, so we're very excited to have Morgan with us with Sylvie as well. We're going to just show a series of slides, starting with, and I know our audience who has made cassoulet before is looking carefully at that incredible crust at the top of the cassole. So let's look at a couple of slides that we'll address during our conversation with Morgan and Sylvie. Here's our crust again. This is what we all aspire to in making a cassoulet. Here's the pot that you're all going to order at the end of the conversation. That's so fabulous, in where you're going to make your cassoulet, going in the oven. And here's Morgan's studio, which she will discuss at length in our conversation with Sylvie as well. Again, the studio. And this is how to purchase Cassoulet Confessions, Food, France, Family, and the Stew That Saved My Soul. You can buy it on Amazon. And then please take note, and I think Melissa will put this in the chat as well, of where you can order your cassole, along with the wonderful little dishes to serve your cassoulet as well. Our goal this evening is to have a conversation about your individual journeys and your partnership. We have some questions prepared, and if anyone at home would like to submit a question, please put it in the chat, and we'll try to get as many questions as possible at the end. Sylvie, let's kick it off. You first went to Occitanie in 2008 to write about the history of cassoulet. What was it about that trip that turned this dish into an obsession for you? How and why did it evolve into a book?
Well, so I have to sort of backtrack a little bit just to explain that I was born in Geneva, Switzerland. French is my first language. Bonsoir, everybody. And in 2008, I was living in New York and working as a food and travel writer. I was working particularly with a magazine that no longer exists, but maybe some of you remember, Food Arts. And Food Arts was sort of a magazine similar to Gourmet, a magazine that basically talked about food and tradition, food and history, and food and culture. And for this particular issue, the editor-in-chief, the wonderful Michael Batterbury, who had already founded Food and Wine magazine, actually. Um, Michael Batterberry had the idea of doing an issue of Food Arts on the one pot meal. And I think we all can remember these amazing evenings, probably evenings, where the host comes out of the kitchen with a pot, and everybody goes, ah, and you already have a party even before you start eating. So he made a list of these different dishes, and when he came to cassoulet, he thought, oh, maybe Sylvie can help. And he called me up and he said, why don't you go to the south of France and write about the history of cassoulet? Cassoulet is sort of an ancestral dish, and there are many different tales about how cassoulet came about. And these are very different tales, and some people believe one, and the other side of the room believes the other. But I thought, hey, sounds great. I'm going to go to the southwest of France. I'm going to interview some chefs, maybe try a few beans, and I'll write the draft of the story in the plane on the way back and move on. In fact, this trip changed my life.
Sylvie, what is cassoulet and what is a cassoulet? And can you give us some insight into how this dish is prepared?
So cassoulet is a bean and meat stew. It's actually a very peasant, very rural dish. Um, and there are many ways to prepare it, but there's also different school of thought. But I thought before we get into the nitty-gritty of the ingredients, if you're okay with this, maybe I thought I'd read just a few paragraphs from Cassoulet Confessions, which is also called Cassoulet Confessions: Food, France, Family, and the Stew That Saved My Soul. Wobbly from almost 20 hours of travel, I swung open the metallic doors of the restaurant kitchen, put my bag down, and stopped short. On the counter, next to the neatly folded apron and the heavy knife, a pig's head stared me down with sad eyes filled with eternity. In my mind, I could still hear my 6-year-old daughter Zoe's squeal as I attempted to embrace her. She squirmed and pushed me away. No, maman, don't leave, she wailed. My husband Michael knelt on the carpet and held her as he waved me on, smiling bravely as our 4-year-old son ran around the living room singing Ring Around the Rosie. Filled with both piercing guilt and elation, I took a deep breath, turned around, closed the front door behind me, and headed to the airport. That's the beginning of the book.
So, would you like to say a little bit more about how the dish is prepared?
So, cassoulet is, as I said, a stew of meats and beans and herbs and vegetables. It comes in many layers. And I thought perhaps, Morgan, do you want to talk a little bit about how you make your cassoulet? Because I know it's delicious.
Well, thanks, Sylvie, and thank you guys so much again for having us tonight. And for all of you at home, we can't necessarily see you, but we know you're here, and we are grateful. Um, as Renee said, my name is Morgan Baum, and Sylvie and I have been working together for just over 2.5 years on this wonderful project and this journey about cassoulet and clay and family. And we, when I think about cassoulet, I think about hot dish because I'm from Minnesota, and in Minnesota we don't call it casserole, we call it hot dish, and it's a bean, it's a bean stew, and I think a lot of love goes into every layer that Sylvie mentioned as well. So one of the joys of making cassoulet is acquiring all of the ingredients, um, taking the 3 days to go through the process. I think cassoulet is a labor of love, and it's part of the the end result is at every step being very intentional about the beans you put in, the duck confit, the like Sylvie said, the layering, and then of course what we specialize in is it going into a handmade clay pot. And Sylvie and I have broken bread over cassoulet a few different times, which has been wonderful. So we've had, I saw that somebody asked already, but we've had many different versions of cassoulet. And that's part of the conversation we'd love to have with you guys tonight is just like anything in cooking, it's an art. And you put yourself into it. And that's what makes all of them a little bit different.
So Morgan, before we move on, do you want to say a little bit about what is a cassoulet?
Oh, well, that's a great place to start. So there, like Sylvie mentioned, alluded to, there are a couple different schools for cassoles. And so the one that we make, well, we make two, excuse me. The first one we made was for the cookbook author Paula Wolfert when she was writing, and I have it behind me, Cooking in the Southwest of France. She wanted a domestic version of the piece that was featured on the cover that her readers could get a hold of. And so in the book, it tells you to go to the Clay Coyote, which is us, and to get your domestically made clay cassole. I used to have a Post-it note on my wall that said, "Cassole is the vessel, cassoulet is the dish," because I always mixed them up. So it's okay if you guys are mixing them up too. But Paula's was this very conical piece, and that she had brought back on her lap, if the story holds true. And it's about 14 inches across at the top, and it comes down to about a 6-inch base. And it holds 22 cups of stew in the recipe. And it comes right up to the top. The recipe that Paula had made comes right up to the top so that you can get that nice crust we showed in the photos ahead. When Sylvie and I sat down to meet, she has a different cassole that she had acquired on her adventures. And that one, and I won't read from the book because I don't have the page marked, but that one is a flat bottom pot, right, Sylvie? And the fat
rotund.
Rotund, and that's the one we created. So Sylvie and I sat down and said, what could we do to create a piece that has the wider bottom and the rotund middle to help make the recipe that Sylvie was bringing back in her memoir. And it was a fun conversation. We sat just on Zoom like this. It was in the middle of the pandemic, and we said, let's travel the world through pottery and our taste buds and create a special edition cassole that could go with Sylvie's memoir release. So it took us, we made, I think if you remember, Sylvie, we made about 12 prototypes. Yes. And then we ended up with the one we have. A lot of things go into the weight of a pot. This one is about 11.5 pounds of clay, and the handles, especially when you're lifting up such a big amount of food, you want a very sturdy, easy to hold vessel, because the last thing you want to do is have the cassoulet end up on the floor. So.
Yes, I think it's important to say also, Morgan, that in my book we have a few recipes. It's not a cookbook, it's a memoir. It's the story of my obsession with cassoulet and why I became obsessed with cassoulet, which sounds like a completely nuts endeavor, and was. But we do have a few recipes, and we have a recipe that we called the Gateway Cassoulet, and it doesn't take 3 days. So I don't want people to get scared and say, oh my God, who has 3 days to dedicate to a dish? But the Gateway Cassoulet, you can start in the morning and you can eat your cassoulet for dinner. And it's pretty foolproof, right, Morgan?
Yeah, we actually came together at your home and we had them both side by side, which was amazing.
So why is cassoulet an important dish, both Sylvie and Morgan, for the French region of Occitanie? And then continuing what you've already said, and is it, I mean, you've just said that you can make it overnight, but there is a reason that it takes 3 days, and that does that have any importance or any relevancy to why it's an important dish in this part of France?
So I think I have to introduce here the character of the chef Eric Garcia, who I met on this fateful first trip. I actually went to Carcassonne. If some of you have been there, you know that it is a walled city in the southwest of France. It's beautiful. It's actually got 52 towers. And a lot of people go there for the day. They sort of walk around it and then they go inside, they buy a souvenir and they leave. But in fact, I spent almost a whole week there, and it was magical. When the tourists leave, you know, when the buses leave, you really can imagine yourself being back in the Middle Ages, and it has sort of a mystical atmosphere. In this place, I met a chef, Eric Garcia, who was no other chef I'd ever met. It was somebody who was at the same time a philosopher, a poet, of course, an amazing cook, but also a historian, somebody who had realized that this dish that came from the region basically was sort of like the standard of gastronomy for that region, even though it was a poor man's dish. Because everything in the dish, every ingredient can be found in the region. I mean, this is not about, you know, getting something from 200 miles away. I mean, even when we talked about what kind of beans he was using, somebody said, "Oh, I like Tarbais beans." For some of you, maybe you've heard of Tarbais beans. They come from the city of Tarbes. But he was furious because he said, Tarbes? Why would I use beans from Tarbes? Well, Tarbes was about 40 miles from where we were, but he thought that was too far. And so everything about this man was authentic. And he also felt that it was worth taking the time. It was worth making your own stock, and have it, you know, bubble in your kitchen and sort of smell out your house, you know, 3 days before you're actually sitting down to eat the cassoulet. He took me to meet the duck farmer. He took me to meet the bean grower. But this did not happen overnight. Let me just tell you, he was a character, and you'll maybe read the book and you know, read his story. But at first, he was very very wary of me, you know, a journalist who lives in New York, but who speaks French. You know, what is that? What do you want? Right. And so little by little during that week, I sort of tried to understand who he was. And, you know, I came back to New York, I wrote the story, and then I waited for this image to leave my brain, but it didn't. I kept thinking about this. I kept thinking about the stew. I kept thinking about the cassoulet. I kept thinking about these ducks and why they tasted so good and how does the crust happen and all of that. And a year later, people were making fun of me, you know, saying, "Are you gonna, you know, think about something else or maybe move on in your life from this stew?" Finally, I just thought, you know, I need to go back there. I need to learn how to make this. Maybe if I learn, you know, it'll finally, you know, leave my brain. And so I called him up. You know, a year later, I'd been there. I'd interviewed him. I met the family. The story had come out. You know, it was widely read and all of that. And so I called up and I said, "Well, hello, chef, it's Sylvie." And he says, "Sylvie who?" And that hurt, you know, especially because Sylvie is a very common name in France, but I sort of felt that he knew exactly who was calling. And I said I'd like to come back, and maybe, would you allow me to intern, or as we say in the culinary word, would you allow me to stage in your kitchen? And he was like, why? They don't feed you there in America? And I said, no, no, they feed me. They feed me all right. But, I haven't been able to forget this. And, I'd like to understand it. Anyway, all of this took a lot of convincing. But I did go back and I did learn how to make cassoulet. Sorry, that's a long answer.
Well, I
Thank you
think
so
you should
much.
talk a little bit too about what happened when the organization welcomed you in, because I love that story.
So when I first arrived back to 2008, as I said, I was thinking that I'd be sitting at the corner of a counter in the kitchen. I've interviewed many chefs in my life. Let me just tell you, just so you don't think this is romantic or anything like that, very few chefs feed you when you come to interview them, right? And most of them don't even give you a glass of water. True story. But so I was prepared for anything. I was there with my notebook. I just thought I'll just, sit on in the kitchen and take notes. But in fact, when I arrived, first of all, his restaurant um, was a 12th century castle, and it was just outside of the walls of Carcassonne. There was lavender outside everywhere, basically lavender field and bushes of rosemary. So already you're sort of in this sensory, almost overdose, right? Even before you step into the kitchen. And then you come into the kitchen, and so what was funny was that I didn't come into the kitchen. They opened the dining room for me, which never happens. And in the dining room, I saw a table set for 25 people. And the people who were expecting me were wearing red robes and red beret. They looked like Oompa Loompas. And they spoke a language I'd never heard before, which turned out to be the ancient language of Occitan. When the cassoulet was ready, they went into the kitchen and they took a stretcher, a wooden stretcher covered with a fabric in silk, red and gold fabric, that said Universal Academy of Cassoulet. And on the stretcher went this humongous pot, which Morgan, I think, probably was about 4 times the size of our pot.
Yes.
Right? And from this pot came this aroma that I just thought was out of this world. And it sort of was, still simmering. There were bubbles there. You saw the picture. It's a good picture there. It was golden. It smelled amazing. And they started singing in Occitan, and the parade started from the kitchen into the dining room. I mean, I was pinching myself. I was thinking, where am I? What is this? Is this real? And then they put the cassoulet in the middle of the table. Eric Garcia came, and with a big wooden spoon, he went at it, put some of this weird looking bean thing on my plate, and I tasted it. And everybody became silent, stopped talking. They all looked at me, and I tasted this, and it felt like the taste of home. Except that in my case, and you will see this, it didn't make any sense.
I love that story.
So the next question is for both of you. Can you share with us the various ingredients? I think Sylvie's already spoken a little bit to some of the recipes that are in her book. Possible substitutions, because those people who have made cassoulet can be pretty strict in terms of how they see the recipe, and add to that, if you can, perhaps what kinds of wines or other drinks would you serve with cassoulet?
Well, Sylvie, you want to start?
Sure. Um, so Eric Garcia believed that there were three main recipes for cassoulet. The one from Castelnaudary, the one from Carcassonne, and the one from Toulouse. Okay? And this theory came from an ancient book that he basically considered to be the Bible of cassoulet. Okay? But in I mean, we have more than three recipes in the book. And a lot of people have asked because cassoulet is mainly pork, duck confit, and beans. Sometimes there's lamb. Sometimes there is different part of the duck also. And also in Carcassonne, they put partridge in cassoulet. But a lot of people have asked me, what do we do if we don't want to, eat pork or if we don't want to eat meat? And so for people who don't eat pork, I've actually devised the cassoulet with veal shank instead of pork. And that works great. Actually, we've made this a few months ago here in New York City, and it was absolutely delicious. And we also used chicken sausage instead of the pork sausage. So that was one thing. And then for vegetarians, it's a little more complicated because we don't want this to become a soup, right? That's really important. The texture of cassoulet is different. It's, it can't turn into something too liquid. So what I would do for the vegetarians is to use the Beyond Meat patties or sausages just for texture, just to add a little bit of difference, between the beans and the veggies. Do you want to talk about the wine, maybe?
Well, of course. And before we get to the wine, though, I'll say, there's often the question about whether you can cook it in a metal pan versus the clay pan, and the argument is that there's something very special about using a clay vessel for this process. At the Clay Coyote, we make both the cassoulet, and then we also do make a clay Dutch oven that can go on the stovetop for some of the stovetop per preparation that you'll be doing as well. So when I did the duck confit, I did it in our Dutch oven. The cassoulet is only designed to go in the oven. The reason that clay is so nice to cook in is the insulation helps thicken the stew versus the metal pot. So you'll get a better, like Sylvie said, we don't want soup here. We want a nice, deep, rich stew. And so clay will help you achieve that goal. The other thing about clay is it's so traditional. I mean, if you really want to take a bite and travel halfway across the world, you're going to want to use something that kind of helps bring that tradition to your home. And then you take the sip, right, of the deep red wine. It's round, it's full body from Languedoc, the region of Occitan. You have to remember, folks, I'm Minnesotan, so Sylvie always gives me a pass on my terrible French. But I think, when we got together in New York a year ago, and we were drinking a couple different wines from the Occitanie region and alongside the cassoulet, and it just brings the whole dish together. The regional wines, right? The terroir with the regional beans. And I just love what Sylvie says about how Chef Garcia wanted to just collect things that were within less than 40 miles. I, I, I live in a rural community. I mean, this is the dish that is perfect for small communities, hardy winters. This is when we start making our cassoulet and drinking our deep red wines.
think you're making everybody hungry and thirsty for wine. But the next question I'd like to ask is to Sylvie. Chef Eric Garcia is your cassoulet, entre guillemets, master. Can you tell us more about meeting him and getting to spend time with him in his kitchen? And at the same time, you know, there's several towns in Southwest France that claim that their region is the authentic cassoulet. And there's some rivalry, we understand from the book, between them. And so do you believe in a particularly authentic recipe, or can it be determined by location as well?
You know, it's interesting. While I'm listening to your question, for some reason it makes me think of music, right? And jazz improv. So I think that I think you'll agree with me that it's really great to start with learning classical music, even if you want to do jazz, or rock or whatever it is that the young people do nowadays, because you have to know the basis, right? And in a way, Eric Garcia taught me the basis of the cassoulet. He sees, cassoulet in three different versions, and that's wonderful. Um, as far as authentic, I mean, we live in America. It's been pretty tough finding partridges around here. I don't know about you, but they don't necessarily fly around in the canyons of Manhattan. So I'm not so attached to these rules. And actually, I think that cooking doesn't have to be a set of rules. I think what matters is what tastes good to you. So I think I'm pretty, liberal when it comes to this. Now, you want to go to the Cordon Bleu in Paris and learn what Julia Child learned. Fabulous, do it. But then go home and maybe look at your own regional specialties and why they were developed there. You know, if you're in Louisiana, I mean, look at the Cajun heritage. If you're in Minnesota, you know, the Nordic heritage and all of these things. I mean, cooking is something that is not supposed to make us stressed. Eric Garcia is he was pretty tense, let's put it this way. But one of the most striking experiences I had with him was when I came back to do this internship, and he literally had a head of a pig waiting for me on the counter with a knife and the apron. And when he saw me arrive after, 36 hours of travel, he basically, the first thing he said to me was, "You haven't started yet?" So, I mean, it was tough. It was tough.
So Morgan, can we speak to, and here's my pot, which I can't wait to use, the whole concept of authenticity, and the pot. I mean, you've spoken a little bit about the insulation that comes with clay. I mean, does the pot help with that wonderful crust that we all aspire to create? Can you talk about the pot itself?
Yeah, of course. So you showed a photo at the beginning of the conversation of our studio. We have been in Minnesota for 30 years. I'm the second generation owner. My mother, Betsy Price, and her partner, Tom Wirt, founded the company when I was 14. I used to earn my allowance scraping bats in the studio and talking to them after school. They even had a little X on the floor in orange spray paint, because every time we'd clean the studio, I needed to know where my stool would go back to so I could sit there. And I learned through osmosis everything I needed to know about clay and family run businesses. And then 7 years ago, my mom and Tom retired, and I took over with my husband. And we have an 18-month-old daughter, so you never know, we could have a third generation coming someday. And the thing that we talk a lot about when we make our pots, we have a team of 6 potters, and 7 if you include me, in the studio, and we use 2 types of clay, and we're a little different than many other potteries because we use the stoneware clay, which is a traditional clay for baking and serving, and all of our decorative pieces are in stoneware. And then we developed a special type of clay called flameware that is we're one of 3 potters in the country that have this body of clay and glaze that work together to expand and contract and go on the open stovetop or on a grill. And I know, Renee, that you also have one of our tagines, which is a combo piece. It's a stoneware top and a flameware base. But we that's what we're very well known for. And part of the journey of making a clay pot is first going from the piece of clay to the finished vessel. And then when we put it in your hands and you bring it into your home and start using it in your kitchen or with your friends and family, that's when the pot is done for us. The pot is not done until we hand it off to you to make the dishes. And so, when you say authenticity and traditional, I think like, the cassoulet is so rooted in French cuisine. The tagine brings you to North Africa. The cazuela takes you to Latin America and Spain. And so all of these pots are designed, even though they're modern and they're made in a rural Minnesota studio, they're designed to be part of the traditional, authentic cooking experience. We really do want you to have, we don't want everyone to always have to go find the piece. We'd love you all to travel all over the world. Like Sylvie said, go to the Cordon Bleu. Please come back and tell me about it. But also, if you can't go, we have an ability for you guys to do that here in the United States. The other thing I think about is, pottery has some health benefits. There's a lot of questions about whether or not cooking in metal or with synthetics is ideal. I can't speak to all the other pots in the world, but we have no nickel, no cadmium, no lead. We have our clay has a natural nonstick base versus like Teflon, which we all know we're not supposed to have in our homes anymore. And then lastly, cooking with clay is fun. It's a joy. There's a really wonderful Facebook group called Cooking with Clay that we're a part of. I believe it was only a few hundred people about 5 years ago, and now it's over 6,000. And I know we have some members of it on here. It's lovely to see all your faces in other forms. But it's people who love cooking with clay get really into it. And those are our favorite people to hang out with and talk. And like you said, Renee, we're making you hungry. That's one of the best compliments you can give me. When people come into the studio and we're talking about the pot and then the food you can make in it, the best compliment I can get is that people are hungry and that they can't wait to go put these pots into action in their home. I call our pots friends in your cupboards because when you're cooking with them, we want you to feel like, not creepily, but we're there with you.
So, Morgan, before we move on to the next question, I wanted to ask you, I think there are probably people in the audience who really love cassoulet. Why is there some science behind the clay? Because, a lot of people will cook with their Le Creuset. I mean, you've explained some of the things about, it's wonderfully healthy to cook with clay, and there's some tradition and authenticity there. Is there any science behind it that is helpful in terms of the process of creating this dish in clay?
Well, I think, what I alluded to before is clay is an insulator. So it's, and pottery in itself is a very scientific and artistic combo, right? We have a lot of science and chemistry and physics that go into making the piece. And so the thickness of the piece and the compression that we do when we make the base of the clay to make sure that it's an extremely sturdy pot, again, so that when you fill it with 22 cups of hot, boiling, delicious stew, it's got integrity. That thickness also helps create the insulation, which gives the stew base a much thicker outcome than if you were cooking in a thin metal pot. I have taken one of our saucepans and a metal saucepan, and set them next to each other. And I made Kraft macaroni and cheese. The exactly right at the exact same time. Um, and I did it to the, to the gram. I put in all the same ingredients, and the one made in clay was a thick and very creamy, and the one made in metal was not. And it was the same water, the same pasta, the whole thing. Clay, that insulation gives you that creaminess. And you can tell I get excited about clay. It's in my blood. But the difference between using clay to make something traditional and using metal, it goes a long way. So I do want to encourage people, though, if you don't have clay, please do make it in your Le Creuset, or in the Dutch oven in your home, because it's a gateway. It's a gateway to more recipes that you'll want to make in clay later.
Oh, thank you, Morgan. It's fascinating to hear about the science of it. Sylvie, how did you ultimately decide which regional variation is best? And did it come down to method or flavor, or was it because of your relationship with Eric Garcia, the chef in Carcassonne?
So, in fact, if that's okay with you, Renee, I think I want to go back a little bit to the beginning of my adventure, because I feel that I sort of left maybe some people hanging, because I said that it didn't make any sense, right? I tasted that cassoulet and it didn't, and it reminded me of home. So we think back to, oh, that's a beautiful cassole I'm seeing there. Um, that's the conical castle that Carrie is showing us right now. Um, so, in fact, it didn't make any sense for me to think of home while I tasted cassoulet, because I never ate cassoulet in the dining room of my childhood. And I thought I could maybe very quickly read a little bit of chapter one that talks about that. We never ate cassoulet at Beauchamp, my Swiss childhood home above Lake Geneva. We didn't eat lentils either, or any other mundane legume for that matter. But Joaquim Martinez, our loyal Spanish butler, served us plenty of haricots verts, glistening with French butter and dotted with caramelized shallots. Some days he wore his royal blue jacket with gold buttons, some days he wore the red. But he always wore his white gloves as he slalomed swiftly around the oval table. Joachim, my mother would say, help the little one, please. Oui, madame. That little one was me, age 7 or so, with my round face and corkscrew curls. I had recently graduated from eating in the upstairs kitchenette with its red linoleum floor and arthritic dumbwaiter, to the dining room where I sat proudly to the right of my mother and across from my 3 older sisters. I'll stop there, but just to give you a sense that the way I was raised had very little to do with the kitchen of Eric Garcia.
Thank you, Sylvie. We have so many questions, but I want to make sure that we still have a few minutes for questions from our audience, because I see that we already have 14 questions. But I think this question is really, hopefully important, that this book is so much more than just about food. And it appears to be about your personal journey. The subtitle of your memoir is Food, France, Family, and the Stew That Saved My Soul. Without giving away too much of the story, because there may be some people who haven't had a chance to read your book yet, can you explain how all these things are tied together?
Sure. Well, we've talked about food and we've talked about France. Family. I grew up in a wealthy but very dysfunctional family. Actually, I grew up in this house. For those of you, I don't know if you can see the cover here, but the house I grew up in on Lake Geneva had 36 rooms, and the family was. It was not like any other family. I mean, I guess everybody could say that, but my father was Swiss, my mother was French. My mother was a Holocaust survivor, And the way that we were brought up was very formal. And I think that the hunger that I felt as a kid was for more than food. And I tried to leave, come to the US, make my life here in New York, but somehow deep under the crust of the cassoulet, I found the courage to look back. And in this book, I guess my cassoulet is really a metaphor for life, and it's sort of the thread that allowed me to face what had really happened in the family, and that's why it's called Confessions.
So Sylvie, both Sylvie and Morgan, this memoir journey, this sensory journey it has us all motivated, I think, to run into the kitchen and hope that it gets cold enough to serve cassoulet. But I think everyone, before we open it up, might want to know what you're doing next. I mean, you've written for so many impressive publications: the New York Times, the Washington Post, Food and Wine, Travel and Leisure, National Geographic Traveler, and Forbes, just to name a few. Can you before we ask questions from the group, talk to us a little bit about your journey as a writer, and maybe give us a hint of what might be next?
Sure. So I'm always looking for a great story. You need to know this. It doesn't have to be about food and travel, but of course, it's my specialty. Um, the truth is that I am actually working on a historical novel. So I think I've crossed into the fiction world, which is very intimidating for me. But I'm writing about my mother's late brother, my uncle, who was born in Sao Paulo, Brazil in 1918 and died in 1944 in the Resistance in the mountains of France. So he's the hero of my next book. Um, and it's fiction because I don't know that much about him, because the last time my mother saw him, she was 17. So she had sort of an idealized vision of this older brother that she adored. And I grew up with his black and white portrait, in his soldier uniform on my mother's nightstand. Um, and then suddenly I went to ceremonies of remembrance in France with my own son. And suddenly this young man, he was not 26 when he died, seemed to be speaking to me and taking me by the hand and telling me it was time to tell his story. But I've taken a lot of liberties, and it's a little bit of a crazy story I'm writing, but that's what I'm doing.
Oh, thank you so much. So before we open it up, I have one more question for Morgan, because as I think I mentioned earlier, I have bought a couple of pots from her. And so how is this book, this relationship that you have with Sylvie, how is all this in journey that you've both experienced together affected the way changed the way maybe you look at pottery? I mean, are you expanding the kinds of things you do? How do you define next steps for yourself in terms of what you're creating?
Well, I mean, Sylvie and I are lifelong friends now. we we talk all the time. So I think that this has opened up a great relationship for future. And we're always looking for ways to partner with each other. I would say that it's a little bit along the same lines. We in 2006, my mom and Tom put out a cookbook that was made by our neighbors. They bound it together, and it had stories and recipes from our region. And so this winter, I'm releasing the updated version of it, Cooking with the Coyotes, and it's a love of cooking with clay, and it has many of those recipes from before. However, my folks, they organized it by the type of pot you use to make a dish. And I don't know anybody who picks up a cookbook and thinks, oh, I'm going to use this pot. I better go find what recipe could go in there. And so I've rearranged it by more traditional breakfast, lunch, hot dish dinner. And it has, and then it takes you, each recipe tells you what pots you can use. But it also, the 2006, we didn't have the flameware yet. And so now the cookbook features a lot of our flameware recipes. And I love showing people how to cook with clay. So I have a couple cooking classes coming up at the Alliance Française in Minneapolis. I have one which is a tagine two ways, which is a chicken and a fish tagine evening. And so if anybody's in Minnesota and would like to come, it is cold enough to start. It is snowing in Minnesota. So it's cold enough for us to start enjoying Moroccan stew and French stew together.
All right. Well, after hearing that, I'm going to call Christina in Minneapolis at the Alliance Française and see if she can add an owl so that you can Zoom your class to all of us. All right, let's look at the chat. I think we have 17 questions here. All right, let's see. Let's hang on a second. Oops. Here it is a slide with all of the information where to purchase. And please look at this website because, as I said, I have bought the tagine and made an incredible chicken tagine last week. Now I'm losing the chat here. Hang on once. Here we go. Once the slide's up, I can't see. Here we go, the chat. All right. Cindy says, I loved Sylvie's Cassoulet Confessions book and Cassoulet Confessions book, and I love visiting Morgan's studio and shop. Can anyone here recommend a restaurant for cassoulet near Beaulieu, France? We will be there over Thanksgiving.
So Beaulieu is in Provence, which is, you're right, in the south of France, but it's pretty far from Carcassonne and Toulouse. I don't personally know of a restaurant that serves cassoulet there, but it's worth trying. It's worth calling around and seeing if anybody's serving cassoulet. Towards the winter, I would think they might.
I have to add too, every time I go to France, I have a rule that I have to have a croissant every day, as well as a piece of chocolate, because how will I know I found the best one if I don't try one every day? So, Cindy, I hope that you will, if you see cassoulet written in chalk in front of a restaurant, I hope you go in and enjoy it, and then come back and we'll be together in Minnesota and we can talk about it.
James is asking, does Chef Garcia in Carcassonne include fresh tomato in his cassoulet?
He does not.
Okay.
But some people do. Some people do.
Yeah. I never have, but that's interesting that some do. So Alan and Jerry recently got back from a trip to Southwest France in Toulouse. And they say in Toulouse, we had cassoulet twice. It came to the table in a clay casserole that looked just like the one in your picture. It's delicious, but distinctly different from the cassoulet they made in Carcassonne and Cassoulet. We've never yet attempted to make it. Maybe we will. And Alan, we live near each other, so I'll invite you when we can make it together. So can you speak to the difference in the taste of those two, Sylvie?
You know, it's interesting, the taste, right? The taste really has to do with the terroir. So it all depends also in terms of the season, you know, what kind of season you're finding yourself in. A lot of people think that cassoulet is a dish for the winter, but in fact, in Carcassonne, they make cassoulet all year long. And the reason I talk about this is because the taste of the cassoulet has a lot to do with fresh herbs. And all of the versions include fresh herbs. And the question is, where are you getting your fresh herbs from? First of all, are you getting your herbs fresh, or are you using dried herbs? I am a big fan of fresh herbs, and I find that, you know, there's this mix called herbe de Provence, right? That you can get. Personally, I don't think that has any taste, or it's a taste that does not remind me of Provence. And I can't even tell which herbs, you know, I'm tasting. So I would say that the most important part of the cassoulet maybe is the stock and the herbs de Provence. I don't know what the fresh herbs. I don't know, Morgan, what you think.
I mean, I fully agree. So much so that in Minnesota, I asked for one of those herb garden indoor growing kits from my husband 2 years ago, and I've been growing all my own fresh herbs because of it. And I think that you're right. The we think of it here in America as, a warm stew that you eat in the cold winter months. But I think cassoulet is ingrained in French culture, and it can be enjoyed year round. But I'm going to have to do a little research for where I can find a partridge to try to try that version. And when we make the cassoulet in the style of Toulouse in our house, my mother actually makes the sausages from scratch. She makes them herself. I avoid the kitchen on that day, but she does. She makes the merguez herself, so which is really inspiring.
So we have one last comment. We can probably fit in a couple of questions, but I would also agree. I think homemade stock in many cases is the secret to success, especially in terms of creating that consistency that you ultimately want to have. But we have Valerie saying, I have never had cassoulet. After reading the book, I felt driven to make and try cassoulet. The descriptions in the book allowed me to almost taste, but I need the real thing. I've bought all of the ingredients from D'Artagnan, and I'm anxiously awaiting the arrival on December 7th. We are going to use my cast iron pan, but I am rethinking after this discussion. So I can say, I order mine from D'Artagnan. I mean, they do a great job, but you need to get the clay pot, Valerie. You need to order that.
Yeah, I just wrote the d'Artagnan.com website. What I like particularly there is that you can actually get what they have, this cassoulet kit. They call it that. But we've had bad experiences with their pots, just so you know. Their pots have broken. They also sell the pot, but has nothing to do with Morgan's handmade pot. Not everything is top quality, but it's a good way in, just like the gateway recipe. It's a good way in, is what I'll say.
Well, and I think that, it's nice that you can get the whole kit from one place, which I think is very valuable for many people. We're busy people. But as I said at the beginning, there's a joy in acquiring all the different ingredients and reading about them. And somebody asked earlier what bean we use, Sylvie, and I can see it in my head, but I'm having a mom moment. It starts with a C.
Yeah, the cannellini. We
Thank
often use
you.
cannellini in this country because they are sort of the right size. They become tender but not mushy, which is really what you want.
Yeah, and I would also say I joined the Rancho Gordo Bean Club. Again, that was a Christmas present. And I would encourage you I can drop that in the chat too. But the Rancho Gordo Bean Club is a great way to get hooked on beans. And soon you'll be like Sylvie, and all your friends will tell you to stop talking about beans.
That's right. Thank you, James, for dropping the tarbay beans.
Yes, and Carrie dropped in the Cooking with Clay Facebook group. I hope you'll all join us there. It's really, really fun to share recipes and talk to each other.
So we have one more clay question, and I think you might have answered it, Morgan. But forgive me for having a blonde moment if you didn't. Is your cassoulet made of stoneware clay?
Yes, yes, it is. It's the cassoulet is made from a stoneware clay, which is we use a high fire buff stoneware that is rated to 400 degrees. Then, like I said before, we also have another body of clay, our flameware clay, which is rated over 500 degrees. And we do have a 3-quart Dutch oven in that shape, which is a very nice, and it goes on the stovetop or in the oven. But the stoneware is only rated to 400 degrees. So I always like to make sure everybody knows that it's an important when you're cooking with it to know that you put it in a cold oven and bring it up.
Well, I think we're out of time. I want to make sure that everybody looks at the final slide so that they can, if they've not already read the book, it's a great Christmas present. It's a wonderful story. It's a wonderful memoir and really a sensory journey. That also has a little bit of a backstory without giving anything away. I found it to be a very moving book, and I'm looking forward to meeting Sylvie in person, as she knows. So please read the book, buy the book, and as someone who has purchased the clay pots, they're magical. And everything you make in them it's the smell, the taste, it's fun. So please go to Clay Coyote's Pottery Casserole website. And Morgan, I hope you're going to share the cookbook with us when it's published. We would love to learn more about that. And we thank you so much for sharing your time with us. And we look forward to all cooking together. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
You.
you.
Bye, everyone.